So we can start our first meeting of the second round of the shelves. The shelves is a series of CUP Ancient Philosophy volume presentations co-organized by the Ancient Philosophy Group with Leuven, so Julia De Cesaris, and Cambridge University Press. We have here Michael Sharp. We warmly thank Cambridge University Press for the interest they had in this project. So many things changed from the first round. Since during the first round, we were really in a very bad pandemic situation. So people had more time to spend home, unwillingly, mostly. Now we are trying to set up a different kind of format for the shelves. So shorter presentations, we'll have just 1 hour, but, and this is important from an organizational point of view, we will record everything, and you will be able to find, and everybody will be able to find recordings on our YouTube page, so Filosofia Antica a Torino on YouTube. We are starting today with a book on a Platonist, I would say, just because I'm influenced by my own interest, but a book on a very complex and interesting and understudied figure in ancient world. This is Celsus, and this book, edited by James Carleton Paget and Simon Gathercole, represents, in my view, a huge achievement for scholarship. And so the format will be the following. I will first invite the editors to tell us something about the volume. Then we have a discussion for today. Jan Opsomer kindly accepted to present this volume, and then we'll open the floor to a debate, which we imagine is always as informal and as possible. So just please feel free to take part in it, both to the contributors, some of them are with us today, and to people taking part in this event. Maybe we can just use for the discussion the hand tool of Zoom, right? Okay. Just a quick presentation, introduction. James Carleton Paget is a reader in early Christianity and ancient Judaism at the University of Cambridge, and he is co-editor of the Journal of Ecclesiastical History and fellow and tutor at Peterhouse, while Simon Gathercole is a professor of New Testament and early Christianity at the University of Cambridge, and is the editor of the journal New Testament Studies. So please, Simon, James, I just leave the floor to you.
James, I think I'm down to go first, so I'll just say a few things on the area that I agreed to say something about. But first of all, thank you so much, Federico and Arianna and Julia, for inviting us and inviting the book into this panel, and to Jan as well for agreeing to do a response. James and I have both been interested in Celsus for quite a long time, especially the material at the beginning of Origen's Contra Celsum, where there's interaction not only between Celsus and Origen, but also the Jewish figure who appears in books 1 and 2 of the Contra Celsum, and who is used by Celsus as a sort of weapon against his Christian opponents. And so personally, I've been interested for a while in the gospel traditions that are reflected there, and indeed the anti-gospel traditions reflected in that material. But just to give a quick snapshot, we both note in the introduction that, as Federico has just mentioned, Celsus is a rather understudied figure. He's not terribly well known today, and he wasn't terribly well known either in antiquity. He doesn't seem to have had any predecessors in terms of, you know, the way in which he goes about his anti-Christian polemic. We don't know where he was from. We don't know. He's not Celsus, son of a particular person, and even Origen didn't know who he was. Origen guessed that he was an Epicurean from the time of Hadrian, but this is clearly not right, and even Origen himself sort of comes to doubt his initial conclusion of his initial premise about who Celsus was. And in addition to not having any sort of predecessors in terms of the way he goes about his anti-Christian polemic, that he leaves only at best a very sort of patchy footprint as well. He seems to have had little impact on subsequent anti-Christian polemic, and he seems to be unknown to the Church Fathers except via Origen's Contra Celsum, and you know, it's possible that Lucian and Porphyry knew him. Sebastian Muller, in his essay in the volume, thinks that he did have an influence directly on Lucian and Porphyry. And again, he's also neglected by modern scholarship. I think it's partly because of partly he's a difficult figure to study, of course, because he only comes down to us in Origen's Contra Celsum. The study of Celsus's Alethes Logos, as it's termed, is really the study of a sort of palimpsest, and so it is a difficult enterprise studying Celsus to some extent. But he does touch on a number of areas: ancient philosophy, the second sophistic, the study of Judaism, and the study of Christianity, all of which have undergone quite dramatic changes over the last generation, and so he's certainly ripe for a fresh assessment. Just a couple of points on the classical context. The second sophistic is one of those, one example of a very fast-growing, there being a very fast-growing industry of scholarship on the second sophistic over the past generation or so. I think in the blurb on the back of Tim Whitmarsh's book on the second sophistic, this was back in 2005. There's a remark: the second sophistic is arguably the fastest growing area in contemporary classical scholarship. And so it was excellent to be able to have Gretchen discussing the interconnection of Greek philosophy and Roman imperial rule in her chapter, showing that sort of being a Greek under Rome was not an agonizing contradiction for Celsus, and similarly the interplay of rhetoric and philosophy is not one in marked tension, but rather, as in Philostratus's tag, Celsus is engaged in rhetoricae philosophusa, rhetoric philosophizing, which Simon Goldhill, I think, notes in his response to Gretchen. There's also the literary context. I won't say much about these chapters because Gretchen and Richard and George and David are here. It was great to have Richard coming into the volume, and he discusses the ways in which Celsus's use of Homer is quite conventional in many ways, citing for the familiar passages from the tradition, and noting that Homer is, for Celsus, in agreement with Plato, again a common theme, and that takes us into philosophy. Again, as with Richard, I was delighted that David Sedley, both of whom taught me as an undergraduate, delighted that they could be on board. And David traces the way in which Celsus is not just indebted to Plato and Platonic tradition, but his debts go all the way back to Heraclitus. Nevertheless, Celsus regards the Platonic tradition as a continuous tradition, and David touches on a number of fascinating themes, like the way in which Celsus discusses animal intelligence, among other things. And we initially conceived David's paper as a sort of main paper, and George doing a response to that. But in the end, what they did was really to sort of carve up the territory and give full-fledged papers of their own. And George's fascinating discussion covers Celsus's theology in particular, and the way in which Celsus conceives of an impersonal God and the cosmos as eternally constituted by the form of the good. So that was I learned a great deal from all those papers, I suppose Theresa Morgan's paper on Celsus and early imperial religiosity connects up quite closely, especially with George's chapter. So over to you, James.
Oh yes, well thank you very much again to all of you for all the organisers for allowing us to discuss this, and it's very kind also for contributors to be here, and I look forward to hearing from them. Celsus is a bit like an erratic block, really. He suddenly appears up to the time of Celsus, assuming late-ish middle of the 2nd century date. We discuss the complexities of the date. We don't have much information about what pagans actually thought about Christianity. And apart from a reference in Tacitus, we have very little attempt made, almost no attempt made, to draw on polemically or in any other way, the link between Christianity and Judaism. And so one of the things we wanted to do in this volume really was to elucidate, Celsus's view of Christianity, not simply as a representative of a certain type of, I suppose, Colonel Blimpish intellectual, but also to elucidate what it might tell us or how it might impact upon debates about Christian identity, Jewish identity, and related matters in this period. And in relation, of course, to Judaism, it's particularly interesting because we have almost no information about Jews operating in a Greek environment, that is literary information from this period. And so Celsus's Jew, potentially taken from a source, elucidates this. So the essays that touched upon these matters, the essay by Loveday Alexander, I found particularly interesting in that what she was able to show was that Celsus struggled in some ways to situate Christianity in the environment out of which he came. Was Christianity simply a deviant form of Judaism? Was Christianity some kind of a thaumaturgic cult? Was Christianity a sort of philosophical school? He associates Christianity with the syntheki, with a kind of association. And Loveday Alexander wants to break that down into these different categories of synagogue, thaumaturgic cult, and philosophical school. And she shows how, to some extent, Celsus contends with these matters in, I think, a very interesting way. She also makes use of Celsus to ask questions about the kind of narrative of Christianity, or the kind of view of Christianity with which he's dealing. And she draws some quite interesting conclusions about the kind of discourse about Christianity taken from the fall to redemption that he seems to be contending with. One of the questions, of course, is, did Celsus know any Christian apologetic literature? Was any Christian apologetic literature around at that time? And interestingly, Theresa Morgan, in her essay, argues that, in a way, Christianity is on the cusp of becoming an apologetic faith of some kind, but hasn't quite reached that point, and actually thinks is reflected in some of the ways in which Celsus deals with Christianity. On the Jewish front, there are two contrasting essays, really. One by Philip Alexander, which in a quite positivist way attempts to answer questions about the type of Judaism that Celsus may know. He also wonders too about the kind of polemic or polemical view of Christianity Celsus was in contact with as that manifested itself in Judaism. And he has a number of very interesting things to say about the quite distinctive way in which Celsus attacks Christianity. He doesn't attack Christians as Jews attack Christians in Christian anti-Jewish literature, as false interpreters of scripture. Jesus cannot be the fulfillment of scripture. That point is only alluded to vaguely. Rather, the attack is really upon the kind of person, more like a sort of charlatan figure, that Jesus is as portrayed in the Gospels. And of course, Celsus as Jew provides us with some of the most detailed engagement with the Gospel of certain, at a very early period in Christian history. The other paper by my colleague, Professor Judith Liu, is a subtle and complexifying engagement with the different levels at which the Jew appears. The Jew is both used by Origen using Celsus, the Jew is used by Celsus, and there may originally have been a Jew in a Jewish literary text. And she looks at the ways in which these layers of usage interact. And so they're quite diverse indications there. Whether we know that much more about Judaism in this period when we don't know that much about Judaism on the basis of Celsus remains a debate. And Martin Goodman, in typically iconoclastic fashion, and I use that word positively, argues strongly that actually Celsus's Jew is really a Jew that Celsus has come to know through having been a Christian, which is an interesting claim. So he wants to argue that Celsus, a bit like Julian later on, was once a Christian. This accounts for his knowledge of Christianity, and that the Judaism that he conveys is a Judaism conveyed to him through Christianity, rather than a Judaism that is actual and with which he is in some sense in contact. And that rather interesting iconoclastic point is the one I'll end on.
So thank you. Just before I introduce Jan, let me remind to anybody attending that Cambridge University Press is kindly offering a 40% discount on any volume presented this year in the shelves to anybody participating in one of the events. In order to obtain the discount, please send an email to Michael Sharp, and Arianna has just copied Michael's email in the chat. So please, Jan, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to this event. So I will give a presentation of the book, giving some ideas of my own or some things that I find interesting, important. But it will not be an exhaustive presentation of all the contributions, which would be impossible, I think. So one thing that becomes abundantly clear after having read this rich and varied collection of learned articles by a stellar cast of specialists is that this anti-Christian treatise, the Alethes Logos, was a multi-layered work, and that Origen, whose refutation of this work is also our only source for it, or practically our only source, added supplementary layers of complexity. As Mark Edwards remarks in his afterword, this collection of essays does not focus much on Origen's own arguments or his own theological views to the extent that they could be gleaned from the Contra Celsum, but instead focuses much more on Celsus himself as the title, of course, aptly announces. So here we have Celsus, a Platonist and a philosopher in his own right. As we can assume, George Boyce looks at what we can reconstruct about Celsus's own Platonist views on theology and creation. Then we have Celsus, the polemicist, who uses argumentative patterns from the Platonic academic tradition, as is clear from David Sedley's contribution. More about these later. So to attack the Christians and to defend pagan philosophy broadly conceived, but also pagan cult practice. Theresa Morgan's contribution has been mentioned, also her respondent, Sophie Lunn-Rockcliffe, discuss what we can hear about, what can learn about pagan religiosity. Or Loveday Alexander has been mentioned here, so I will not go into that now. So for his attack on the Christians, he moreover makes use of already existing Jewish counter-narrative and counter-proposition, as it is called by Philip Alexander, who in this respect develops Maren Niehoff's thesis and further elaborates on it. Philip Alexander fruitfully compares parts of the Jews' discourses with the Toledot Yeshu in its various manifestations. Philip Alexander leans towards thinking that his Jewish source may have been oral rather than written. And in his response, just mentioned, Martin Goodman suggests that the informant could have been a Christian, or that Celsus himself may have had a Christian past. An interesting thought. What or who exactly his source was for the Jew presented in his Aletheis Logos, we will never know, in my view. Judith Liu resolutely brackets this question and rather looks at the presence of the Jew inside the text as a textual persona through prosopopeia. And multiple layers this introduces, so this stratagem introduces into Celsus's text, and even more so in Origen's text, who can now play out Jews against Platonists in his defense of Christian philosophy or Christian thought. So I've said that Origen's own purposes and strategies are less prominent in this volume, but they're not completely absent. Louis Ayres, in his contribution, very much puts Origen in the focus. While being attentive to the difference in societal context between Celsus and Origen's time 2 generations later, and the different shape of Christianity in these two periods, Ayres argues that Origen also defends the ideal of the Christian scholar, implying that he himself, so Origen himself, represents this ideal. The scholar is bound to certain standards of interpretation and argumentation, and Origen possesses them, contrary to Celsus. Reading the scriptures and reading them well presupposes a certain technique and schooling. Lacking those, Celsus did not even manage to capture the lexis, and then inevitably struggled to capture the meaning, the boulema, dianoia, or hypothesis of these texts. Now, how to deal with text is also very much in the focus of Richard Hunter's contribution on Homer in the Contra Celsum, with interesting observations on ancient ideas about literary decorum and appropriateness, distant relatives, very distant, but still, of contemporary notions of hermeneutic charity. Richard Hunter shows that Origen's use of Homer grows out of a specific critical tradition. As George van Cotem puts it eloquently in his response, I quote, "Much of Origen's argument also seems to be based on the prescriptive principle that what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. Christianity should be treated in the same way that Homer is treated." So you see how these many layers of argumentative or hermeneutical standards are at play here. Through all contributions, I can perceive a strong awareness of the importance of different cultural and religious context and different intended and real audiences to understand the complexity of Celsus's and Origen's works in relation to the works they cite comment upon, and criticize. So you probably expect me to speak at some greater length about the more specifically philosophical contributions. I shall do so, but I shall start maybe unexpectedly from rhetoric and connect that to David Sedley's contribution. So this contribution is called Celsus as a Platonist philosopher. What David shows, among other things, is that Celsus's anti-anthropocentric arguments are indebted to the new academy, so the so-called skeptical academy. Celsus argues that humans are not privileged over other animals. Other animals are as much or even more benefited by the cosmos than humans. The knowledge of non-human animals is in some domains superior to that of humans. Ants and bees have societies, cities, and states, just as we do. Elephants and storks are more loyal than humans. David points to similar arguments in several works by Plutarch, for instance, De Solertia Animalium, De Gryllus, De Esucarnium, including also a fragment from a lost work quoted by Porphyry in De Abstinentia. Porphyry, of course, another animal-friendly Platonist. It's often assumed that Plutarch drew on anti-Stoic arguments developed by the Hellenistic academicians. And David suggests that, quote, Celsus shares with Plutarch this version of academic history, unquote. Now, the character of the Plutarchian works is quite rhetorical, these works that I've just cited, which ties in well, I think, with the dialectical techniques of the new academicians. It is a typical rhetorical stratagem to show, in this case, that your opponent is wrong to think that non-human animals are irrational and inferior to us, but not just that, to reverse the argument and to show that they are superior to us, which is exactly what Celsus does. Now, if we inspect the Plutarchian corpus, more in particular, the corpus of texts that are now known under the heading Moralia, we see next to some few, let's say, technical works, dialogues, works of, let's say, what is often called diatribae, so kind of practical moral advice. But we see quite a few works that are sometimes called rhetorical exercises. I give some titles on the fortune of the Romans, whether the affections of the soul are worse than those of the body, on the fortune or the virtue of Alexander, and so on. So these works take the form of epideictic orations that appear to be successful, or whose goal it is, when the author succeeds in making an unusual or unexpected point. And I suspect that Celsus is very much influenced by this tradition. And it's no coincidence that Johannes Arnold's reconstruction of the structure of the second speech of the Jew in this volume makes use of rhetorical theory, as is also explained in Simon's Responsio. Now, this use of rhetoric brings us seamlessly, so to speak, to Gretchen Redam-Schill's contribution, which places Celsus's philosophical activity in the context of the second sophistic. Gretchen not only raises the question about the political reality of Rome, but also brings Celsus in the vicinity of other authors whose work can be situated at different points on a scale between pure rhetoric and dry philosophical treatises. Now, if we think back of Plutarch, so we first came to speak about Plutarch from David's text. So we see an author that whose works can be found on different locations on that spectrum, depending on what text you're looking at. And as for Celsus, Celsus too marries philosophy with rhetoric. Now, that makes me wonder if we look at other figures of so-called Middle Platonist philosophers about whom we do not know much. We usually have only fragments that are preserved by Neoplatonists. And the idea that we have of these philosophers, because we have just these fragments, is that they were philosophers much like the Neoplatonists themselves. So authors of commentaries, or rather dry technical manuals or treatises. But that may be a misleading impression. So a figure like Celsus shows that probably most of the philosophers, or at least is an example of a philosopher that is not that type of philosopher, but someone much more like Plutarch, for instance. So much more, you could say, embedded in this second sophistic, or much more prone to use rhetoric, to use all kinds of literary forms, to discuss or to quote poets and discuss on them, like Plutarch does, like the authors mentioned by Gretchen in her contribution on the second sophistic do. Now, Gretchen also mentions the problem of the title, Alethes Logos. Hardly an appropriate title for an adherent of the new academy, one would think, or even of the fallibilism of the Fourth Academy. Origen is aware, she argues, of the fact that the title may well have been inspired by a passage from the seventh letter. This is an idea, by the way, already put forward by Chadwick. So, and I didn't quote the translations, but in Contra Celsum, book 6, chapter 9, Celsus is cited as citing Plato's seventh letter. And in these words, in this text, you have the words esti gartis logos alethes. So it has been disputed whether this is indeed the source or the source for the title of the work. Gretchen also cites some other texts, for instance, a passage from the Meno, where Socrates says, or Meno asks, Tina logon, do they use? And Socrates says, alethe, I think, and so on. Mark Edwards, on the contrary, cites Timaeus 26e, where Socrates proposes to strive for an alethinon logon. And we should not forget the interesting suggestion made by David Sedley that the use of logos here may be inspired by Heraclitus, whose logos is ancient, universal, and true, exactly what Celsus needs and what also Origen would want. I will come back to this just one more time, but first let me say something about a related topic. So historians of ancient philosophy working in philosophy departments, or let's say in analytic philosophy departments, usually do not want to be seen spending much time on rhetoric, on Sitz im Leben, on authors targeting audiences or authors situated in societal, religious, or political contexts. Much safer to stay with doctrines and even better arguments. Now, that the study of Celsus is also important from the doctrinal point of view is perhaps most clear from George Boyce Stone's chapter. George compares Celsus's views on the Demiurge, on God and creation, with several contemporaries of his. He offers an original and convincing interpretation of what it means for a God to be called Logos. I found that especially insightful, and uses Apuleius and Plutarch to corroborate this case. Now, on his interpretation of Celsus's theology, which I share, Celsus's creator God is the highest God, ineffable, the form of the good, prior to intellect and being, the sole creator, that is the sole God prior to the cosmos, but not the only God. He is impersonal, or it is impersonal, but nonetheless provident. And George concludes by saying that this theological conception is not so unusual for Platonists before Plotinus, Numenius being the major exception. So what this does make clear is that Celsus has quite strong views on theology. What he says about the creator God and how he characterizes him is something that he strongly believes. So, and if you do, there is no reason to refrain from calling your work alethes logos, I would say. Now, in the light of this theology, there is this interesting chapter by Sebastian Muller later in the book, where he discusses the influence Celsus may have had on later anti-Christian polemicists. And he cites, of course, Porphyry, Julian, and Hierocles. Now, I think more work definitely needs to be done on a comparison between certain anti-Christian arguments that you find in Celsus and in these later polemicists that on the surface look the same, but given the fact that the, let's say, simple or standardly Middle Platonic theology, so as George has argued, nothing special in a way, is very different from, let's say, a Iamblichian theology, such as we find it underlying the arguments by Julian, or that we find in the fragments of Julian's against the Galileans. So I think this is certainly now a domain where more research is needed. So it's not possible in the span of a short presentation to do justice to the richness of this volume. And I have not, if I haven't mentioned every contribution and every contributor, I apologize. But I want to conclude with great praise. This is a landmark volume and an exemplar of fine scholarship, but also, and this should be stressed, and hasn't been stressed yet, I think, by the editors, it's also an example of collaboration. It is manifest that the different contributors have all talked to each other, and more importantly, listened to each other and read each other's text when writing their own text or prior to writing their own texts. The volume is truly interdisciplinary, or you can also call it transdisciplinary or multidisciplinary. I've just heard that interdisciplinary is not a fashionable term anymore. I don't know why, but anyway. So the scholarly work can only thank the contributors, but also and especially the editors, James Carleton Paget and Simon Gathercole, for convening the contributors and making them collaborate in such an exemplary fashion. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan, for this presentation. Very stimulating presentation. I have, in fact, a couple of questions, but I would prefer to leave the floor to anybody who wants to either reply or supplement what Jan said, or just ask questions on his presentation. Just please use the hand tool if you want. George, please.
Well, I'm just embarrassed by the silence, really, and I for the sake of saying something, I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you to Jan. I think you were given a very difficult job reviewing this whole book, and you did it very beautifully, I thought. I was slightly disappointed that you agreed with me in the way that you said you did, though. I was sort of expecting to disagree. I was kind of trying to disagree with you in a way, so why do you agree? I mean, I'd be interested to hear more about your perspective on Celsus.
So I think the one point of apparent contention, but I don't really think it is a point of contention, is about things that I have written about Demiurgy. So I've written this long article in which I compare several authors that talk about Demiurgy. And one of the tendencies that I thought I could see in this, across these many authors, was a tendency to attribute demiurgic tasks to lower divine figures. So to have a second, a third demiurge and helpers to the demiurge, to Demiurgy. Now, so to the principal demiurge. Now, in some authors, you can see this very clearly. And one of the things that George says in his contribution, there's only one demiurge. But I think the difference between us there is mostly semantic, in the sense that, so even for let's say, I take an author like Numenius or Plutarch, and I make a case that in some of the, well, in Plutarch, let's say, the world soul takes over certain demiurgic tasks, right? But that does not mean that the soul would be a pre-cosmic demiurge or would not be the product of the demiurge. So such a view is still perfectly reconcilable with saying that there is the true demiurge, so the first creator of the world. For Plutarch is clearly the highest god. And I think in this respect, there is a lot of convergence between the two authors, except of course that for Plutarch, well, except many things, but the main distinction being that for Plutarch, this isn't a personal god. Whereas Celsus clearly thinks it's impersonal. So I think the apparent difference in views has to do more with how we use the term demiurge. Now, if we go back to Plato, Plato uses demiurgeo, demiurgos in many, many different contexts, not just for Plato's, so for the Timaeus demiurge. He uses demiurgy in the Sophist to talk about the Sophist who creates images. And later Platonists took this to be a reference to lower forms of demiurgy. So maybe it is this, if you think, okay, I have a very pure and well-defined notion of demiurge, namely that figure who in the beginning of the physical account of the Timaeus is called the demiurge, then you would indeed could object to certain of the things I write on this in this respect, I think. But that's not what I meant. So I don't think I ever claimed, and this is something you also write, George, and maybe I can ask you. You at some point you say, I hope there is no author who ever thought that the world soul would be the demiurge. I don't know of any, and you say I don't know of any ancient author who thought that, and I hope no contemporary scholar thinks that. I hope you don't think that I think that, because I don't know of any Platonist author who would say that the world soul is the demiurge.
Yeah, I might have misread you. This might indeed be a matter of rhetoric, because I thought I'd caught you saying that World Soul is the real Demiurge, or maybe Alexandra Mikulewski says this. But I've certainly read it said that the World Soul is the real Demiurge. But your point is, so I think rather happily we converge here on the text of Plato, because of course that's exactly right. Plato attributes Demiurgy all the way down. In fact, in the Timaeus, he even attributes it to the elements at one point, the elements of Demiurges of things. So good. I'm pleased to hear that we agree more than I thought we did. Thank you.
One more thing, when I say real Demiurge, I may have meant the following. So if in view of the Epicurean criticism of the Platonists, as you find it, for instance, in Cicero, the idea is that the gods could not engage in this kind of manual labor. And then I may have said something like, okay, but the persons or the principles that do the real work are often lower figures. And you could say, okay, the real Demiurge, but that doesn't mean that it is let's say the father maker of the cosmos.
Gretchen, I don't know whether Kazara had a follow-up on this. Perfect. So, Kazara, please.
Follow up on this. My point is also follow up on this specifically.
Okay, so perfect. Gretchen, please.
So, according to Donini, but I don't agree with that interpretation. Alcinous would have identified the Demiurge with the world soul, but I don't think that interpretation can hold.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just follow up with another note? Dillon thinks that Speusippus did the same, although I don't agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's follow up. Another thing which is quite ambiguous is the very notion of personal God. I mean, and this is, of course, typical of scholarship on the Timaeus as well. So once one says the Demiurge is personal because he has a providential plan, but I don't think that having a providential plan, even a planning, implies being a personal God, which probably needs something more and so on. And of course, at that stage of the tradition, things are even more difficult, since we have a sort of standard set of terms, boulesis, pronoia, and so on, or the Demiurge being glad of his own work, which of course derives from the Timaeus, so they are forced to some extent to use this kind of images which do not imply any kind of personality and so on. This was just sort of recurring puzzle for me when we're reading this kind of text.
Can I say something on that, Federico?
Yeah, of course.
So I think the decisive point is, if you have a God who episodically and actively intervenes in the cosmos when things go wrong, then you have a personal God for sure. And then you have, because that's a God that perceives a problem, thinks of a solution, and intervenes to make a solution. And there you have wanting and thinking and agency, which I think are hallmarks of personality. But I agree that there are many, let's say, much less clear cases.
Yes, in the sense, what I meant is that, for instance, he is an intellect, is a good intellect, and once and for all, wants the world to be such and such, to work in general in such and such a way, then I don't think he could do anything else, or just planning that the world is the best it can be in a sort of intentional way. Let's allow me to use this bad word, ambiguous word. But this still doesn't imply that he has a specific target. True. In this case or this other case. So I would take this kind of intermediate case, the Demiurge intervening once in the world with a very general plan, not implying personality still, while if one intervenes case by case, that might imply personality. And there might be even another kind of case, which is, for instance, Taurus' case, in my view, someone who, God who doesn't really intervene, something like that.
I agree with that. Maybe one more thing. It also depends a lot on what notion of intellect you have. So if you are ethicus and you have a strongly anti-Aristotelian take on intellect, and you deny that it's an immobile, self-thinking mover, then there is more room for that kind of interventionist behavior. So yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. Gretchen, was it a follow-up? Kazra?
Please go ahead, Gretchen, afterwards.
No. After you. I already spoke once.
Because I don't have a follow-up in the narrow sense, I have a general observation which at once addresses several topics and themes that were discussed, as well as manages to disagree with Professor Boyce-Stones as he wished. So maybe Gretchen go first and then afterwards.
Yeah, I guess my point is a relatively smaller one, but if I'm correct, Jan, the treatises of Plutarch on the intelligence of animals also derive from some Epicurean and peripatetic material.
True.
And that's important because Origen systematically lumps Celsus together with the Epicureans and the Aristotelians on the number of points. That's really important for his polemic. So I think what Celsus is doing there, if there's something to Origen's point, is not just picking up on the new academic tradition, but also on these other traditions, which allows, Origen to lump him together with the Epicureans and the Aristotelians, also on providence, by the way, because, there's Epicureans deny providence, the Aristotelians only have a limited providence. And it's really interesting. It creates this tension in Celsus' thought, which of course Origen does not fail to point out, that Celsus does want to hold on to some kind of privileged connection between human beings and God. But what is left of that privileged connection, if even the animals have a notion of God, and then, Origen quips and says, well, in that case, the chickens have a better understanding of God than Celsus. But, right, so...
That I think is a typical, let's say, rhetorical play to say that animals are closer to God than humans. I'm not sure what to make of the fact that he's brought in close vicinity with the Epicureans, or is called an Epicurean. So I don't remember who said this or who wrote this, but someone in the book wrote something about that that Origen deliberately interprets his view Celsus's view on providence in such a manner that he can say, this is not what I call providence, or this is not what providence really is, so that actually he has, well, it amounts to the same thing as if he were an Epicurean.
Yeah, I made that point, and this George, I thank George in the footnote. That's also Atticus' strategy to lump Aristotle and the Epicureans together on their, as if their views weren't different, because Aristotle's view on providence is too weak.
So I didn't get whether Kazra still has to.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I have a rather broad point.
So Kazra and then Emanuele.
Okay, so the idea that I have, first of all, I would like to express my thanks to the organizers and everyone who contributed to this very interesting discussion. The idea that I had is that if we take this rhetorical dimension of Celsus seriously, we can make sense out of several observations or several remarks that he makes that are otherwise hard to at least take at face value. One was the idea that humans in no way occupy a more noble or higher place in the hierarchy, in the overall hierarchy, than the other animals. Another one is the idea that on which Boyce-Stones and also David Sedley have given their thoughts, that God is the logos. I think that the ideas that Boyce-Stones in this regard put forward are very fruitful and interesting, but if I remember it correctly, David Sedley replies to that this is a generally rhetorically motivated passage, and we should not take it at face value that God is indeed the logos. but more in the context of the following sentence, which says that God cannot do something that is paralogos. So the general idea there is only that God always agrees with logos. And in order to make this point, Celsus deliberately exaggerates his position by making a rather extreme claim that God himself or God itself is the logos. And I think another even better passage to illustrate this, which was not discussed today, is 4.5, where Celsus claims that if you would change the tiniest bit here on Earth, the whole order would collapse. And so he puts forth this idea that there is no real change, and that there is specifically in the material realm no change at all. Only then in the following fragments to very much put forth an idea how there is change and why this change happens in some cyclical notion. So for Celsus, as for every Platonist, I guess there is, of course, change in the material realm. Specifically, the material realm is characterized by change. Nevertheless, he makes a very exaggerated claim that there cannot be any change at all, not regarding even to the tiniest bit. And of course, there are different readings of this passage that can make sense out of it. But if you again take serious that Celsus had some polemical goals and some rhetorical dimension to his work, I think we can reduce this statement to, let's say, his critique of Christianity and the idea that God coming, ascending or descending to the earth is a rather problematic notion and doesn't go well with his overall understanding of nature and of theology. And to bring us to an end, there is another good reason to assume that Celsus did so. And this has to do with his understanding of philosophy in general, because he, at several instances, makes the case that it is now too complicated, or it would be too subtle to go into the details. So I will end my discussion here, and whoever wishes to know more, he shall find out by himself, or something along the lines. So he refuses to give philosophically more sophisticated explanation at several points. I think this also has to do with how he understands philosophy and the difference between an elitist discourse and, let's say, a discourse for the popular people. And it seems so that in his LFS Logos, it is not his primary goal to outline his theology or his metaphysical beliefs in detail and deliver arguments for them, etc., but to make a few or some general points, some polemical points. And then even at the very end, where he announces his second project, even for his second book or the next book, he did not set out to, or he does not announce to make this more theoretically rich approach to LFS Logos, but a practical ethical one. So his focus is not, at least in his written works, on outlining a theoretical system of beliefs, but how to lead people to the LFS Logos, or to the true wisdom. And the first step in this book was to refute Christianity and refute the false notions that go with it, introduce some of the correct Platonist notions, and then the next step would have been presumably to outline the practical way to reach this truth. And then if he would have written another third work, maybe there we could have expected him to express in detail his theological beliefs. And none of this, I mean, that I just said is, I will leave it as by that for now.
George or I?
I'm happy. I mean, the trouble is that you know, this is all we've got. So I mean, the challenge in a way is how much we can squeeze out of the evidence we actually have. And I should say, my own approach to the whole business, I stand by what I said about the Logos, but I'm myself being deflationary about this in the sense that I was responding to the Michael Frader's rather rich assumption that as soon as Logos is brought in, you've got a whole new God. So I'm quite sympathetic to your cautionary remarks.
So we had Emanuele and then James.
Yeah,
Please.
Just thank you. Just a very brief remark on the notion of personal God in the Platonic tradition. I think that a question which might be raised in order to explain a personal God is whether God cares for individuals. This is crucial to understand whether God only has a general plan, so providence in very general terms concerning the entire life of the cosmos, or cares for individual living beings which he has produced. This is crucial. And it seems to me that the typical Middle Platonist God only cares for universals, not individuals. So this is he's an intellect who looks to the forms, but not to individual living beings in this sense. I don't know if Federico agrees, if you agree on this point.
Yeah, and I would entirely agree. One exception, on one hand, is Atticus, to some extent at least, which is consistent with what we were saying, at least in fragment 3, if I'm right. He says we must be looking for providence, for a God who really has an impact on everybody's life, or something like this. And on the other hand, it is quite interesting that you have these systems implying demons. And to some extent, this might be a way in order to free God from this aspect, which, however, must be there. But yes, I would agree with you.
I would say that a care for individuals is compatible with not being personal. For instance, when I think of Proclus, very late, of course, but there you have statements that says that the gods know and have providence for individuals. So Heniatic gods, or the first principle even, without there being any possibility of ascribing personality to them, I think. The thing is how they act in order to make sure that the care actually means something for those individuals. If they set up, if being a god means being the principle of such a structure that will ensure that individuals will somehow fare well in this structure, then you can have an impersonal God that has providential care.
So I would, we have James with the last question.
Yes, I'm sorry to lower the tone from the discussion of providence, but it seemed to me that the implication of what Kasra was saying was that was interesting for the whole purpose of this text that Celsus wrote. I mean, is Christianity simply a Trojan horse for discussions of a wider philosophical kind, because Kasra suggests a second and a third book that may touch upon even more abstruse matters? Or is it the case that Celsus really is pretty appalled with what he's seeing and wants, to attack this? So it's not, what's the relationship between his polemic against Christianity and his wider concerns, or are there actually wider concerns here to be? I mean, that's a very general question thrown at all of you from a very non-philosophical point of view.
Maybe as George said, if we only have origin as our lens to which we see Celsus, then it's very hard to make any claims about, let's say, a positive agenda or Celsus as a systematic thinker or someone who devises a system or doctrine, philosophical doctrines. If most of what we have is just no, you Christians, you're wrong. So,
I mean, I think the title is interesting, though, isn't it? Because the title Aletheis Logos is, on the one hand, presumably it has some contact with the Christian claim about the Logos as incarnate in Christ. But on the other hand, it is a positive, it is a title which implies a constructive agenda as well as a controversial one.
Mm-hmm. Here, I think David's suggestion is very useful, to think of Heraclitus, and the way in Heraclitus this idea of logos is immediately connected to or associated with the stupidity of all these people who don't want to see this. So even there, it is immediately polemical. But you're right. You would think that aletes logos, you would get, let's say, a more or less doctrinal expose on theology and ethics and other issues.
Great. So we went from silence to a huge debate. And I am very glad. That was very nice. And I would like to thank the editors of the volume, the contributors, and everybody joining us in the discussion. Thank you so much. Once again, thanks to Michael Sharp, who is offering a discount on the volumes. And next week, we'll have the second event. Probably you can see now. The title is Riccardo Salla's Cosmology and Biology in Ancient Philosophy, from Thales to Avicenna. And it will be again on Wednesday at 6 Central European time. So thank you so much again. And well, the link in that case will be another one. So if you're interested in joining this other event, please just send an email to receive the link. And have a nice evening, and happy Easter as well.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.